Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Board Basics webinar for the Mid-America region, Part 2. My name is the Reverend David Pyle. I am the regional lead for the Mid-America region. I also serve as the primary contact, so the first call for support from the UUA for our congregations in Minnesota and Wisconsin. As you know, the other members of our staff, the Reverend Dr. Lisa Presley, the Reverend Phil Lund, the Reverend our program staff, Sharon Dittmar, and Nancy Cummins Morgan and Cameron Young. Those of us that serve as primary contacts serve as your first call for any support from the UUA. And if you have any questions about who your primary contact is, go to the UUA website for Mid-America, and there's a wonderful graphic divided up by state to let you know who your congregation's primary contact is. It's great that we're here together this evening. This is session 2 of a 3-session series that I actually developed a couple years ago and have been presenting every year for new board members to be able to have a better idea about what it is that you are getting into since you have agreed to serve as a board member for your congregation. Now, if you are not serving as a board member, that doesn't mean you can get it's okay. You're perfectly fine to stay on this call, on this webinar with us, because much of what we're going to be talking about is general leadership, especially tonight. It's really general good practices of leadership to be able to serve a congregation, to be able to serve in your congregation in a lay leadership role. With that, we'll go ahead and get started. I first want to run through what we're going to be doing tonight, and then a little ad for what we're going to be doing in August. So tonight, our agenda, we're going to talk about technical and adaptive skills for board service, adaptive challenges versus technical problems. We're going to be talking about a little metaphor that we often use, comes out of the practice of adaptive leadership from the Harvard Center for Adaptive Leadership, Ron Heifetz. It's called the balcony versus the dance floor, as a way to understand your role as a board member in relationship to all the activities of the congregation. We're going to talk about differentiation as a leader, and we're going to spend a little time, and this is the part that most people really like about this workshop. We're going to talk about the difference between confidentiality and transparency. And we're going to talk about we're going to talk about healthy disclosure, including a 4-part process for congregational boards to be able to talk about difficult things with their congregation, to share difficult news or challenging times with their congregation. I'm admitting a couple of people from the waiting room. So we'll then talk about linkage, or that process of how you as a board member, how your board remains connected to other congregation, to all the stakeholders in your congregation and beyond in your community. We'll speak about board covenant and speak with one voice, what it means for a board to speak with one voice, voting and consensus power, and we'll talk about healthy conflict in boards. And we are going to do all of that in 1 hour and 15 minutes. I promise. You all know these webinars. I start them on time and I end them on time. But hang with me. I did this last time. I need everybody to reach up to that seat belt above you, bring it back down and buckle it in, right? Because when we do these in person, all 3 of these hour-long sessions we do in a 7-hour in-person workshop. So we're going to be running a little fast with this, but there are plenty of resources and other materials that we'll talk about at the end that you'll be able to access to engage this material in a deeper way. So I want to also name what our workshop for session 3 is. This is on August 25th, same time, 8 Eastern to 7 Central. We're going to be getting into some of the nitty-gritty of how to be a board member in the August session, including one of the most challenging things that I've run into with boards, how to read a congregational budget and profit loss statement. I know some of you all may be executive directors of nonprofits and have experience at this, but I know the first time I stepped on a UU Church board, the profit and loss statement was frankly a foreign language to me. And so at the little piece, we talked about what you're looking for when you're reading a budget or a profit loss statement. We'll talk about what process observation is, how to use a consent agenda in board practice, what it means to do a board workshop instead of a board meeting. We'll talk about the powerful questions and cottage meetings and town halls as ways that you can engage in the deeper ideas that are within the congregation and within the board. We'll talk about board culture and the different board roles and positions and the difference between open sessions and executive sessions. That's all coming in the August webinar. So does that feel like a lot that we're engaging this over this summer? Remember, if you have any questions, feel free, you can put them in the chat. I will engage them. Members can't get in too many numbers in the member ID. That is the member ID, the one you have up there. For people that have got in, Shannon, I see that. If you could tell me who can't get in, that would be helpful. And if someone is unable to get it, have them try it again. It should be working because some people are here. But and I don't have anyone waiting in the waiting room that hasn't been admitted. So have them try one more time. And if not, the best thing we'll be able to do is help them be in the record, so they'll be able to access the recording. So thank you for naming that, Shannon. And it's also good to see you. I had the privilege of serving as Shannon's minister at one time. So I'm going to move us to the first session, which is a slide that we used last time, but I'm just going to name, well, we'll get to two slides. First one is use the chat box to ask questions. One of your colleagues didn't get an invite, so you shared mine. That's fine. If you could type their name into the chat, that would be helpful for me in admitting them. Remember, we asked people to register. That's a security feature that we do because of some of the Zoom bombing incidents that have happened in the past. That's why we make it a little more difficult than just clicking a link to be able to get in, to be able to help protect you all from having someone come in with the intention of disrupting our meeting. So the slide deck, when I do this slide deck, it's designed for both graphics and notes. So you will get the slide deck, and I will make sure that it comes out to you all, because that works as a notes document for you. Feel free to take any notes you wish, but know that the slide deck will be coming to you. We'll be sharing, if we're sharing stories or questions in the chat box, please remember, please remember that this is not a confidential space, that this is a space that is going to be on the internet. So for example, I tell this story, I was leading a workshop, a webinar, and a person from a congregation asked a question that was really revealing about the state of that congregation's relationship with their minister, which was not good. And so when that went on the internet, you can guess that some members of the congregation and that minister were a little taken aback by the fact that this person had discussed online a very confidential, sensitive nature. So since boards deal with confidential issues, I ask that you keep that in mind. Remember, if there is an issue that you would like support on, you can always reach out to me or your primary contact on the Mid-America Regional staff for that direct confidential support. And if you can't find your primary contact, email me, dpile@uua.org, and I will help make sure you do that. We're being recorded, we said that, and presenters, as I said, are also available outside the webinar. So once again, our majority of our work as regional staff is not leading webinars like this. It's one-on-one consultations with congregations. It's being available to you and as board members and as leaders with questions, with concerns, with helping you find resources. That's the core of the work we do as your Mid-America Regional staff. We do the webinars kind of just for fun. So next slide is the one I put into this webinar. It was in the last one. I'm going to use the thing. There are assumptions that I make coming into any webinar where I am talking about board leadership. And I think the best thing we can do, we all have assumptions, we all have preconceptions. I think the best we can ever do is to tell people what our best guess of what our assumptions and our preconceptions are. And they can judge what we share based upon those assumptions and preconceptions. So here's a few of the assumptions and preconceptions that are behind this webinar series. The first one is that the purpose of church is not governance. The purpose of church is the congregation's mission. Governance is good when it is serving the mission. We don't come together as a church so that we can have committee meetings, although sometimes it feels like it. right? The spiritual practice of unity, somebody told me this once, that the spiritual practice of Unitarian Universalism was board meetings. And that may be what we feel like, but the spiritual practice is the mission. It's transforming the world. It's creating a religious community for people to be healed and to be whole and to help transform the world. It is living our values in a world that so desperately needs them. It is speaking truth with love in a world that doesn't hear truth all that often. It is, so governance is good when it is helping you and your congregation to live the mission. When governance appears to be all you are doing, then governance is not serving the mission. It's my first assumption coming into these webinars. The second is that culture is stronger than structure. It took me a while to learn this, doing work with congregations, both as a minister and as a congregational life consultant. But you can make all the structural changes you want to in a congregation. You can move things around on a diagram. But until a congregation shifts their understanding of who they are and what their purpose is and what is the assumptions behind how we are together, then people just keep doing the same things. That culture in a congregation, and culture is the hardest thing to see. I tell people, if you want to know about your congregation's culture, this worked better pre-COVID. I have faith we will come back to a time when we are back together in person. But so once we are back together in person, the exercise I tell people is find someone who's been visiting your congregation for about 3 weeks and take them to lunch and ask them to tell you about your church, about your fellowship, about your congregation, because they haven't adapted to the culture yet. They're still determining if the congregation's culture, so they can see it in a way we who have been part of a congregation for a long while can't, because it has just become the water we swim in. So that culture is stronger than structure. The most effective ways, I really do believe this, from now 10 years as a congregational life, well, 7 years as a congregational life consultant, 10 years as a consultant for districts and regions, that the most effective way to make changes in a congregational system is for a few individuals to change their own functioning. That when you get a few people, this is core family systems theory, when you get a few people who start acting different, the congregation then changes around them. A few people beginning to engage in a congregation in a healthier way causes others in the congregation to then change their own functioning within the congregation. There is no single right way for a congregational governing board to function. There are lots of different ways to do congregational governance. I know that for a while we've talked a lot about policy governance. Policy governance is not the only way for congregational governing boards to function. Dan Hotchkiss is governance administrator. Though I love him, he is a friend. It is not the only way for congregational governing boards to function. I find that almost always a congregation develops a way of functioning that best suits its mission when it has intentional focus on how are we going to serve our mission. I also don't believe in this thing called best practices. A lot of best practices is a term that comes to us out of academia and education. There are many ideas that may work in your system and you don't know until you try them. Best practices assumes that all of our congregations are the same. I've worked with over 300 congregations now, and I can tell you we absolutely are not. That all the congregation's history and culture, its relationships, its founding, its history of ministry, its history of lay leadership, makes each of our congregations really a unique stew. That means that different practices, different ideas, different things function differently in each congregation. And the best thing you can do is try them, see how they work, adapt them to fit your circumstance. So those are the assumptions that I bring into this webinar series. And I invite you to just hold them. Never take a deep breath, because we're going to change gears a little bit, and I'm going to start doing some content for this webinar. You ready? If you don't know why I'm looking over here, it's because you all are on a screen over here, so I see your faces over there. So, adaptive challenges versus technical problems. This comes to us from the Center for Adaptive Leadership at Harvard. Ron Heifetz. The book about this that has this in it, this and the next piece, is called The Practice of Adaptive Leadership. I highly recommend anyone who wants to engage deeper, both in your professional life and in your religious life, with the concept of leadership. It's a great text. But they described this key conundrum in leadership at all. And I have a little story to tell. Now, I will tell you, this is a true story from a congregation, but it is not a congregation that is on this call. Shannon, it's not Midland, I promise. So there was a particular Sunday that I came into church one morning, and the lights were off. It was a Sunday morning. We're going to have church, and there's no power. There's no electricity. The lights are off. The soundboard's not working. I don't know what's going on. I go to the fuse box, right? Because that's what you do. And if you don't know to go to the fuse box, you find the building person, right? Because every congregation's got building people. And we love our building people. But in my congregations, I've always been one of the building people. So I go to the fuse box. And I look, and all the fuses seem fine. And I'm, concerned about what are we going to do? Because the soundboard's not going to work. The lights are not on. We can't make coffee. We couldn't make coffee. So I called to one of the building people that we have, and they said, "Oh, I don't know if we can get it fixed by church time." I ended up going out to the local coffee shop and getting some of those coffee in jugs. But we ended up having church without the soundboard, without lights, without anything, and it was a fun experience one time. But after church, we managed to get a hold of an electrician. The building guy called and had brought the electrician in. And the electrician had come up and said, let me look at your fuse box. Looked at the fuse box. It was fine, right? And said, no, it's not your fuse box. The electrician then goes outside, looks at the street pole, and says, aha, I know your problem. Your problem is that they've cut the power off at the street. I'm like, they did what? So we do a little more investigation and come to find out that there was a dispute between the treasurer and the office secretary about who got to control the checkbook. And one of them, the treasurer, had taken the checkbook home with them and hid it. And nobody had paid any bills in like 6 weeks. No bills were paid. So a technical problem is a problem by which there is a known solution that can be accessed and resolved with knowledge and expertise, right? So I had a technical problem, I thought, and that was that the power's off. I'll go to the fuse box and I will flip the switch and that will turn the power back on, right? Known problem, necessary expertise may be present in the group. Me, I could work the power, I could work the box, but it was also available if I needed to by calling our building person or by even going to the electrician. Let's say something had been wrong with the box. The electrician could have come in and fixed that. When the necessary knowledge or expertise is applied, it solves the problem. You get the idea of what a technical problem is? An adaptive challenge is a dissonance or a problem that will require a change in relationships and or human functioning to effect. The actual challenge we had was an adaptive challenge. Who got to control the checks and write checks for things, right? And anytime that you have humans involved as a core aspect of the problem, it's probably an adaptive challenge. In congregational life, almost all challenges that we run into are adaptive in nature because they have humans involved. Church is a human-centered endeavor. Occasionally, we may find a technical problem, but often what we think is a technical problem, we just haven't looked deep enough into what is the cause, what is behind that problem. So, for example, when I went and flipped the switch on the switch box over and over and over, and it didn't solve the problem. That's a key to me that this is not a technical problem, right? When you apply the technical solution and it doesn't fix the underlying problem, it's a key that that is not a technical problem. There may be some technical problems that are symptoms of the adaptive challenge. For example, somebody needed to get a hold of the checkbook and write some checks and take those checks to the places they needed to go, right? And the problem in an adaptive challenge, the problem will persist or even come back in a different form in spite of a technical problem. All right, and I'm going to tell you all, this is a sort of fictional story. Something like this did happen. I wanted to simplify it a little bit. It was actually much more complicated than somebody took the checkbook home. It was a dispute between who signed the checks and who had the authority to sign checks. So the challenge here is that many of our times as leaders, we want to go to the technical problem. We want to address the technical problem. Why is that? Because the adaptive challenge is often so large seeming that we can't even grasp it. We can't even get our hands around it. And because it's going to be messy to address the adaptive challenge, because it involves people, it involves emotions, it involves feelings, it involves relationships. And you never actually fix adaptive challenges in most cases. You help adapt around them. You help the system to adapt. You help people to adapt. Now, there will be, like I said, some technical aspects to an adaptive challenge. And we can often, when we then address the technical piece of it, got the checkbook, sign the checks, send the checks out, we can feel like, okay, now we've solved this initial problem, but that adaptive challenge is still in the system. That relationship problem remains in the system, and it's going to come back some other place. So the key of leadership here is noticing the difference between technical problems and adaptive challenges, and then making the leadership practice of addressing the adaptive challenge, of doing the relationship work, of bringing people back together. So natural human tendency is to first view the adaptive challenge as technical problems. Whenever an adaptive challenge comes up, it's very nature to look for the technical pieces of it. It takes intentionality to look for the ways that relationships and human functioning need to change in order to engage the adaptive challenge. And they may never be solved. You don't really solve adaptive challenges. The system adapts around them. They often point governing boards towards issues in the congregation's identity, culture, mission, and vision. I'm sure you've heard of mission vision before. We talked a little bit about it last time. I always speak about it in fours: identity, who you are as a congregation; culture, the assumptions people have to accept to feel comfortable in your community; mission, what you want to do in the world; and vision, the world you want to create. So often an adaptive challenge points to development work for a governing board to do on one of these four areas. There was a cultural issue in the congregation of East Overshoe that I'm naming. There is no congregation of East Overshoe. That's the name of a congregation I use when I don't want to name what congregation it is. There was a cultural issue in that congregation about power and control of money. And it's that cultural issue that the board needed to address long-term to help the congregation adapt around that adaptive challenge. And sometimes the way you work on adaptive challenge involves not solving a technical problem. This one's really hard for boards to be able to grasp sometimes, is that solving the technical problem takes pressure off the system. It takes away the feeling of urgency. Sometimes you want to let the technical problem stay In this case, I probably wouldn't have worked with this congregation to leave the power off, right? But I might have wanted to say, what if we didn't solve all of these bill things right now? What if we let some of this pain stay in the system so that people are forced to come to the table to talk about the power issue, the control issue that's at the heart of this challenge? So sometimes a board's work may be to let technical problems rest in the system in order to keep people engaged in the challenge. And sometimes a communication disconnect occurs between those who see the adaptive challenge and those who only see the technical problem. I'll tell you, I as a consultant get this call all the time. One person will call from a congregational board or from the congregation and will say, well, the board is making too big a thing of this. We just need to make Mary sign the checks. But the board's making this like it's some big cultural thing when it's just Mary. Mary's the problem, right? It is and so educational work has to be done by the board within the congregation to help people who are not seeing the larger adaptive challenge to be able to see it in the system. Does this land with everyone? Are you getting the core concept behind? This is a key part of board work, being able to parse out what is an adaptive challenge and what is a technical problem. And depending on your congregational system, especially in larger congregations, solving the technical problems may not be the board's work at all. Especially if you're in a policy governance system, or you're in a governance by policy, or you're in a strong executive system. It may be that the staff's job or committee's job is to solve those technical problems, and that the board's real work is on that adaptive challenge, on that identity, the cultural, the mission, the vision question that is brought up on how our congregation engages with issues of control and power, how our congregation engages with issues of white supremacy culture, how our congregation engages with issues of ownership. I'll tell you, one of the most painful board meetings I was ever a part of was a board meeting in a congregation that spent an hour and a half talking about who got keys. Has anyone been in that board meeting? Because I think it happens over and over and over. But which was really a technical question, who gets keys, that is actually an adaptive challenge on the sense of ownership that our members have of the congregation, and what it takes for people to feel connected and in ownership of the congregation. So I'm going to shift to another piece of learning from the Center for Adaptive Leadership at Harvard, and the book, The Practice of Adaptive Leadership. And this is the idea of the balcony versus the dance floor. Now, it would be one thing if, like in many nonprofits and in corporations, you as a board member, your primary role is serving on the board. The primary way you engage in the institution is serving on the board. If you've served on the board of an academic institution, or the board of a nonprofit, or the board of, the board of in a corporate world, primarily as that board member, your primary work is going to be the work of the board. I know I talk about when I worked for a hospice in Chicago, we only saw our board members as staff of the hospice. We only saw our board members once a year, and that was at a fundraiser, a joint fundraiser that the board and the staff all came to, called the Angels Ball. But the rest of the time, the board and the staff didn't have any interaction. All of their interaction was through the executive director of the hospice. They weren't working as nurses for our hospice. They were not going out to visit patients. They were not coming to help us restock the PPE supply closet, personal protective equipment supply closet. They were serving as the board. And so it was really easy for them in that environment to stay in that view, the overall looking at the entire system view, because the entire system was where they spent all their time, looking at the overall institution of that hospice. Church is different. We talked about this last week, about our last session, about why church boards are different than other boards, and this is one of the things, because hopefully you as board members are deeply involved in the life of the congregation. Hopefully you are religious education teachers and you're coming to worship and you're greeters and you're out doing the justice work and you're on the Zoom calls and organizing the Zoom coffee hour in this time, right? It's rare that we have board members that are solely in a board member role in our congregations. And even if we could do that, we probably wouldn't want to. We want our board members to be deeply engaged in the life of the congregation. So as a board member in a congregation, you have to be able to do a mental switch between being, and this is where the metaphor comes from, being on the dance floor, teaching RE, working with the greeters, doing the justice ministries, sitting in a sermon that moves you, being one of the worship associates in a sermon that moves others, in a worship service that moves others. To do that, to be that through all of your time in the congregation, except when you are serving actively as a board member. And to be able to make the shift from being on the dance floor to being on the balcony watching the dancers on the dance floor when you move into your board role, when you put on your board hat. To be able to see how the dancers of religious education are interacting with the dancers of worship. To be able to see how the greeter dancers are interacting with the membership committee dancers. To be able to see the system. This is one of the hardest practices for members of congregational boards, is making this shift. Because we're not just the board member who is only a board member. And sometimes, as members of boards, we have to make difficult decisions. We have to be able to discern when a shift in the budget might affect something we deeply care about, but is the right answer for the congregation. May not be the thing that I personally want to have happen, but from the balcony view is the right answer. So from the dance floor view, your view as a religious education teacher or a greeter, or even just a member, you see mostly those that are dancing with you the closest. We often, one of the other metaphors for this, we call it the churches within the church. That there are often in most congregations, there's multiple different churches that people feel their deep connection to. Anybody members of the choir? Choirs are churches within the church, right? Choirs are their own spiritual community, their own supportive community. Religious education becomes this too. Social justice becomes this, right? So we on the dance floor, we see those of us, and the things that we see are bound by the fact that most of the people that we are dancing with. We're engaged primarily in the dance with those that you're doing with others, and you see your dance out of proportion to the rest of the dances on the dance floor. I'll tell you, one of the ways this comes to me as a consultant is someone who tells me, well, I don't see what's important about youth religious education. And I ask them why. And they say, well, I don't know anyone in the religious education department. I don't know any of the children. Because they're not dancing in that part of the dance floor in the congregation. Now, it's a good learning to try and encourage people to dance in more of the dance floor, right? That's a good learning to help people to gain a broader experience of the congregation. But as a board member, you have to be able to make the shift artificially, really. You have to be able to name this shift to yourself when you're coming into doing board work, to be on the balcony, to step off the dance floor and step into a role on the balcony. We're able to see all of the things that are happening in the congregation and see the interactions between the areas of the congregation. And I love this one, to see the ways that changes in the music affects all of the dancing system. So, I as a minister, one of the things that, I remember being able to do was to introduce a different theme or a different, because the pulpit is a powerful place that you can use to help change the rhythm of the congregation. And it was amazing to me to be able to, begin preaching about something from the pulpit or naming something and watching the system of the whole congregation shift and adapt around that. So as a board member, you need to be watching for that as well, and even helping to inspire that change. And make changes in the environment so that the dance is better for everyone. You all get the metaphor. One of the dangers of being a minister is that we go to seminary for 3 to 4 years to learn to overuse metaphors. So this one is now overused, but I think you all get the basic point of this mental shift that board members need to be able to make. So we talked about how most board members are also dancers, and coming into your board role, you have to be able to set that aside a little bit. That doesn't mean you don't remember the lessons from it, but you don't make it the primary way you're engaging in your board leadership. So you're not engaging in your board leadership as an RE teacher. You're not engaging in your board leadership as a social justice coordinator. You're engaging as a trustee of the congregation, which in our faith tradition means you are a religious leader of Unitarian Universalism in your city, your town, your community. Ministers are religious leaders, but in our tradition, going back to the, our pre-pilgrim days and going back to, the community of the gathered saints, and it is the elected leaders of a congregation that are the religious leaders of Unitarian Universalism. And so you as a board member, you are in that elected leader role for our faith tradition in that community. More than just being an RE teacher or a choir member. You are still those things, and they still inform your leadership as a board leader, but you're a leader of the whole. And this is, like I said, I'm spending so much time on this one because it's such a difficult climb for many to be able to make, especially when tension goes high, when there is something that is a challenge, when relationships in the board struggle, when there's conflict. It is a natural practice for us to revert from the balcony to the dance floor, right? So I'm just naming this for you to be aware of it. And when you feel yourself thinking from those roles that you hold on the dance floor, making that intentional mental practice of trying to get back up on the balcony, trying to see the whole system. And you also have to be able to get off the balcony and get back on the dance floor with all of the people that you work with in church. Elsewise, I'll tell you, most board members that I speak with tell me that the reason why they're serving on the board is because of their roles on the dance floor, because of the things and the parts of the congregation that they most dearly love. And so you need to be able to be that. One little piece of advice, though. People will always see you first as a board member. Not once you're serving on the board. When they're talking to you, when you're in religious education and you're co-teaching with someone, yes, they're talking with a co-teacher, but they are also talking with a board member. And so you need to be listening with the ear of the balcony, right? Be listening with the ear of, this person's now raising this issue about the budget with me, not with me as a teacher, but with me as a board member. Me in that balcony role. So we take a deep breath. Because when someone does that, when someone confuses the role, when someone who you are working with as, I'm using religious education, but let's take the choir for a moment. When someone who's a choir member with you comes to you to speak to you about a concern that they have, and they're doing it within what initially appears to be your role as a choir member, but you realize that they're actually, I'll use the word, lobbying you as a board member, there's a little thing that can happen, and we can attach personalization to that. We can attach feelings to that. Self-differentiation is a practice that we teach, and once again, we do this in a longer session, and I will tell you, we're going to be offering this year, starting in September. You can find the dates on the Mid-America website. We're going to be offering an extended leadership experience of the Midwest Leadership School. So an online, it's not really a version of the Midwest Leadership School, but it's an online experience this year for parts of the Midwest Leadership School. And part of that is going to be on this topic, on the topic of self-differentiation as a leader. And so I encourage you to think about it. If you have the time and you want to engage, it'll go through August through November. I think there's 4 sessions that will be available for you and for members of your congregation. But the self-differentiation is the ability to say, someone is coming to me with an issue that is about our shared institution, about our shared religious community, that is not about me, even if it feels like it's about me. That I am not at the center of this person's concern, of this person's complaint. Even if they want to make it about me to raise my anxiety, to raise my engagement level, right? Self-differentiation is the practice of being able to separate yourself in your mind and in your heart and in your spirit from personalizations that people want to put upon you. So every congregation or any group of human beings creates an emotional system of interlocking relationships. This is a little bit of family systems theory, if anybody's familiar with it. It's just a natural pattern. When human beings are in relationship to each other, we form a system of interlocking relationships. And every person in the system is affected by this system of interlocking relationships, this emotional field, at both a conscious and unconscious level. Awareness of the self as separate from the emotional field, while still remaining aware and connected to the emotional field, is the essential practice of leadership. So my being able to say, Brad is really mad right now about a change in the budget. And Brad appears really mad at me about it because I'm a board member. And Brad's not on the balcony, Brad's on the dance floor. The budget affects part of what Brad loves in this congregation the most, the budget change. I get that Brad's mad, I even get why. But Brad's not really mad at me. Brad's mad at the situation. And I, as a leader, I, as a board member, I am just the part of the system that Brad can focus that feeling on right now. So I'm going to take a deep breath. Do it with me again, deep breath. Maybe 2. And I'm going to do my best not to react to Brad as if I am personally responsible for what has made Brad upset. Does this make sense? This is a practice that is really hard to do. I've been in ministry now for 14, 15 years, and I still struggle with this sometimes, right? And part of this is, if you're familiar with the Buddhist teacher, the Shambhala Buddhist teacher, Pema Chodron, Pema teaches about something she calls fishing, or getting hooked. That people want to hook you. They want you to react personally. They want you to react emotionally, because that shifts the power relationship between you and them. And that's not something they're doing intentionally. It's a natural it's a natural practice among human beings. It's a natural part of the system, of the emotional field, of the family system that we all exist in as members of a congregation. So you have to be aware of your own self as a leader, and aware that you are representing the congregation and the congregation's board as a member of the board, and be able to not react when those things come at you in a personal manner, because they will. One of the things about we Unitarian Universalists is that we have a strange relationship to authority. We often like to say that Unitarian Universalists are anti-authoritarian. I don't think that's actually true. I think we like authority being there because we want to be mad at it. Is that it helps us to be mad at authority, right? So you know, anti-authoritarian, we wouldn't want there to be any authority at all. No, we like authority being there. We just want to be mad at it. And so often board members are in that position. I've had board members tell me, you know, like 6 or 7 weeks into serving on a board, especially during a congregation and some conflict, that they then say, you know, I had lots of friends in this congregation before I became a board member. And my saying, that's not about you. You still have friends in this congregation. I'm going to shift this a little bit. So the leader is the person who can most influence the congregation's emotional field by responding to crisis with calmness, inertia with challenge, bewilderment with focus, and new conditions with change and adaptation. I like this slide because I often, with boards, will give them this slide and tell them, just put this up every once in a while, especially boards that are dealing with conflict. Just put this up every once in a while for everybody to remember and hold on to, right? Crisis with calmness, inertia with challenge, bewilderment with focus, and new conditions with change and adaptation. And that takes you being able to be on the balcony. It takes you being able to hold some self-differentiation, to see the reaction as different to your own self. And it takes being able to tell what is the actual adaptive challenge and not the technical problems. So this is the slide that helps me really help people to grasp what we mean by differentiation. Because talking about what is a lack of differentiation. So undifferentiated leaders, you all have met people that are undifferentiated leaders. They tend to be reactive and instinctive. They tend to do things in a covert manner. They tend to be demanding and stubborn. They think in binaries, us versus them, right versus wrong, with me or against me. They tend to be impatient, put most of the responsibility on others. They tend to be uptight and defensive, very competitive, vague and non-specific, and they tend to create one-sided solutions. Now, I'm not going to say that we have some national experience recently of what undifferentiated leadership might look like. I wouldn't say that. That would be inappropriate. But I think we all are getting this in a deeper way right now than maybe we would have a couple of years ago, maybe 4 years ago. A differentiated leader tends to be responsive and intentional, overt, that what they do in view with some transparency. They tend to be flexible and adaptive, open to a range of ideas, that there's not only one or two answers. They allow for process. They allow for things to go through good format, good form. Take responsibility for themselves, to be relaxed and at ease. They tend to be collaborative, clear and objective, and they tend to create common goals rather than one-sided solutions. Now, none of us are ever purely differentiated. And none of us ever, maybe, a few years ago, I would have said that no one was ever purely undifferentiated, but I don't know that I can say that anymore. But the piece here is that we all flow on the spectrum somewhat. And awareness helps you to know where you are, helps you to be more on the differentiated side. And really, when someone is undifferentiated as a leader in your congregation, I'm not going to speak nationally about this, but when someone's undifferentiated, there is often some way to come alongside them to help reassure them, to help, especially someone who has been differentiated in the past. Something has happened emotionally. There's often a pastoral need there that fellow members and even leaders can come alongside and help that person to be able to return to differentiation. There is the thing I'm trying to say here is that for the most part, there's not a line of you're either undifferentiated or you're differentiated, because that's another binary. For most of us, this is a flow between this. And on one issue, we might be highly differentiated. And on another one, we might feel some deep personal connection that makes that difficult for us. So once again, we're going to do another deep breath to transition into another module, what would have been like a whole nother block in an in-person workshop. So take a deep breath. This is one of the most common questions that I get as a consultant about what is the difference for boards between confidentiality and secrecy. And I've spent probably about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years trying to come up with a good answer. And I'm still not completely satisfied with this one. But we're going to go with it. And I think you all know, as a minister and as a chaplain in both hospitals and in the military, I do a lot of work with confidentiality. And I think many of you know that I used to be a special operations intelligence analyst for the US government. So I've done a lot of work with secrecy, right? This is not meant to be the government definition of secret. That's a whole different thing. This is meant to be when a secret is acting in the congregation, for you to be able, as a board leader, for you to be able to tell the difference. So confidential information is information from disclosures, the information that is withheld from disclosure to create space for necessary work and transformation. The core thing that defines confidentiality is its purpose, is why a piece of information is held confidential. And it's for necessary work and transformation, that if this information were public too soon or were made public in the wrong way, it would prevent the ability for important work and transformation to occur. Now we think about this in terms of pastoral care. It's the easiest place to understand this, right? You know, I as a minister am in pastoral confidential counseling with someone about something in their life that if that became public, would make it much more difficult for them to do the necessary spiritual and emotional work around what that thing is. And that they may get to a point where, hopefully, in many cases, they may get to a point where they can share that information in a broader and broader circle because they've done some of their internal work around it, right? And making the space for that internal work is the purpose of confidentiality. It's also at times information where the benefits of disclosure to the system are outweighed by the negative personal impacts upon an individual or individuals within the system. Let me give you a real example, a live example from this one. Congregation a few years ago had their treasurer be accused the treasurer, who also worked in financial work in their non-church work, in their professional work, was accused of financial misconduct in their personal life, in their professional life, in their non-church work. There had never been any question about this person's integrity as the treasurer or in the financial work of the church's finances. But this was a real accusation, and there might even end up having been criminal charges involved. And so that treasurer came to the board and said, look, I'm going to tell you all this. It's breaking my heart this happened. I'm going to tell you all I didn't do this, but I'm being investigated for this misconduct. I'm going to resign as treasurer because I think that's the right answer. I'm going to ask that we don't tell the congregation why just yet. And the board weighed that and came to me as the district executive and weighed that and made the determination to abide by that request. Turns out the person did not do it. Their boss did, and we're framing them to take responsibility for that. And it was the right decision not to tell the congregation, but the board also put in place the necessary steps to protect the congregation. They did an audit. They accepted the resignation of the treasurer, and they held the confidence. And it did come out that the person in the town was being investigated, and there was some questions to the board. And the board said, you know, we were aware, this was part of why this resignation happened. It also became public when the person was publicly cleared, right? And they were able to maintain support for this member of their congregation through a very difficult time because they held the appropriate confidentiality through that process. Confidentiality is often a temporary restriction, like this one was, but not always. There are some times where the impact of the system, the negative impacts to an individual or to the system, may permanently outweigh the disclosure. There are also times, and this one is the most common place where boards struggle around this issue of confidentiality and secrecy, where public law, especially regarding employment, makes it impossible for the board to tell the congregation confidential information that is being withheld because of employment law. And that's really hard for congregation members to know, especially when someone's been let go, when a person's employment has been terminated, and everybody wants to know why, and they want to advocate for that person. And the board knows the reasons why that, because it is in the board's appropriate purview to know the reasons why that staff member was terminated. But it is not appropriate legally to disclose that information broader than the board. That's one of the hardest of the confidential issues for board members to hold. And I will tell you, if you are in that position as a board, reach out to your regional staff. We have a lot of experience helping boards to discern what it is you can tell in that circumstance. And we also are bound by that same kind of confidentiality. So know that we as a resource are there for you. Let's switch to secret information. How do we define secret information? And I used to say, for this piece, I used to just say, it's really hard to define what's a secret information, but most times you feel it in your gut. Most times when something is acting as a secret, it feels icky. And that's because power is attached. Secrecy is almost always information that is withheld for the purpose of creating or altering power dynamics in the system. Somebody is gaining in power by a secret. And being able to identify who is gaining in power. One example was a congregation that I worked with on a different coast that had, well, we're not on a coast anymore. I'm not on a coast anymore, you all may be. But a congregation that was dealing with someone who had made a very, very large anonymous donation to the congregation that was then letting individuals know that they were the person that made the anonymous donation. That would go to, you know, certain power people and ask for something that they wanted, and when the person said, I don't know that we're going to do that, we'll say, well, you know, that big anonymous donation, that was me, so you should do what I told you to. Oh, and it's anonymous, so you can't tell anybody else that I'm the one that did it. Right? So power is attached. Somebody is benefiting from the power dynamic. It's often a way to bind individuals together through that shared access to the secret information, and creates division within the system that leads to distrust. And it advantages one person or one group in the system over others. So a little work with most boards can usually tell whether something is confidential or whether something is a secret. And I make the case to board members that if something is purely a secret, you don't have to hold it confidential. Now, the complicated piece comes in with the fact that there may be confidential aspects to a secret, because a secret may not just relate to one person. There's a particular congregation that I served, once again, not Midland, no Midland stories in this workshop, Shannon, I promise. There's a particular congregation I served where there was an affair happening between two leaders of the congregation. And some people were brought into that secret, and other people were kept out of it in order to bind a small group of people together to support what the two individuals involved in that relationship affair wanted to have, right? And those people were brought in by relationships, by feelings of responsibility to each other, by feelings of what they thought was confidentiality into this power dynamic that was very unhealthy. I use those two stories to name to try and get at the feel, because it's really the feel that tells you which is which here. Remember, confidentiality creates the space for necessary and important work for transformation. Secrecy creates power. Does that help? So appropriate confidentiality by a governing board can feel like inappropriate secret keeping based upon the congregation's trust in a board. This is one of the challenges for congregations that struggle to trust their board. And I will tell you, my experience is Mid-America, congregations trust their board more often than I've experienced in other parts of the country. That's just a new learning I've had in the last year coming back to serving on the Mid-America regional staff. But the amount of distrust between a congregation and the board can take things that feel like appropriate, that really are appropriate confidentiality, but people in the congregation can react to them as if they're secret keeping, because the power dynamic is in that distrust, right? Congregations that manage information well are more likely to be trusted with exercising appropriate confidentiality. If your congregational board does good about putting minutes up and talking with the congregation about things that are happening and engaging the congregation in, and I know it's hard to do, congregations don't always want to know what the board is doing until they really want to know what the board is doing. But the more you are proactive in managing information well, the more likely the congregation is going to trust the board in exercising appropriate confidentiality when that is needed. You build that trust up before you need it. And, our congregations attract people who can have a history of difficult relationships with power. And that's, I think, part of our ministry in the world. I think people who have been hurt and wounded by institutions are often drawn to our faith communities. People who have been hurt and wounded by people exercising power inappropriately are drawn to our faith communities as part of their healing from those experiences. But with that comes that they will often engage. They bring that distrust with them in a way that we have to hold lightly and recognize that this is self-differentiation. Recognize that that's not about us, and that we need to do our best to do good communication, to do appropriate confidentiality, to do because we are helping them to trust in groups of human beings again. And there are also cultural differences that relate to how individuals and systems react to the line between confidentiality and secrecy. Much of our conceptions are bound by our cultural conceptions, and what may be an appropriate level of confidentiality to someone who is coming from a New England white Anglo-Saxon cultural background may be very different for somebody who is coming from a people of color community, where there is a higher expectation of shared information and transparency. And so recognizing those cultural differences and how we interact with each other is part of how we create the beloved community. Not assuming that all of us share the same assumptions, but bringing those assumptions together and talking about them with one another to find where the mean is within our community. So it's a wonderful book, and if I had the money, I would buy a copy of this book and give it to every board. And I would love all of you. I don't get any money off of plugging this book, I promise you. But this is a really great book for boards. It's called Healthy Disclosure. The subtext, you probably can't read it in the slide, says Solving Communications Quandaries in Congregations. And it's really about how you communicate well as a congregation, especially around difficult things. as a board member, you're included as one of the information trustees of the congregation. And the board collectively makes decisions about healthy disclosure. So you must be conscious about what information the board has, be intentional about what the board does with the information it has, analyze your own motivations. I'm not going to do, we're running a little behind, but so I'm not going to do the whole summary, but you'll get the slides. What I want to show you is this. This one you'll see in the book. We'll just let it be up there on the slide for a minute. Different types of information in congregations. And the different types of informational disclosure. Once again, you'll have the slides. These are pretty self-explanatory. But what I wanted to get to was this. In the book, there is a 4-part practice for how boards can engage in communicating about difficult issues within the congregation. Difficult issues that may have confidentiality attached to them. And this process you will have, I will also attach a sheet version of this process, a handout version of this process to the email that comes out to all of you with the slides and the slide decks and the video. So you'll get this in a handout version. If I could laminate these and keep them in board meeting rooms, I would love to do that, because it takes you through the steps of assessing the situation, determine, and I've seen boards, what I love them to do is just walk through. Let's say that the issue is, let's take the story we told a little bit before about the board that discovered that their treasurer came to them and told them that they were going to, that they were being investigated in their in their non-church professional work for an ethics violation. To state the situation, determine who knows what, like one of the questions there, does the press know about this yet? Is an important question of determining who knows what. Identify all the relevant facts. Who owns the information? In particular, that one was important because the board decided that the treasurer owned this information. The board didn't. The treasurer, who has a right to the information? The treasurer decided, the board did. The board decided that they were not yet in the place that the congregation had a right to this information yet. Determine whether anyone is at risk or of foreseeable harm, and investigate applicable rights, rules, policies, laws, and so forth. That's step 1. Step 2, consider the options, determine the plan. To develop a plan, and often your regional staff can help you in developing a plan for communicating about difficult things that you have to communicate as a board. Act, and then come back and evaluate. After you have done this, was the decision made carefully in consideration with all the people involved? Did you maximize good and minimize harm? Was it an authentic decision based on truth and trust? To come back and ask yourself those questions afterwards, because this is not going to be the last difficult question you have to engage as a board. So one note on transparency. Transparency comes out in workshops like this all the time. We just need more transparency. Transparency is a passive form of disclosure. By transparency, what you are doing is wanting to set a standard that everything should be shared. The challenge of that is that very few people can take the time and effort to engage everything. What transparency often does is make it difficult for people to know, my congregation members and others, to know what they really should know. Transparency can be one of the best forms of obfuscation, because no one can take the time to engage in everything. What is needed is healthy disclosure, is good disclosure, is discerning what are the right things that our congregational members need to know, and how do we communicate those most important things to them in a way that they can receive. However, transparency itself is often a necessary step in rebuilding trust in the governing board. So when something has happened and when trust with the governing board isn't there, it has fallen apart or has been damaged, often boards have to revert to transparency in order to rebuild the trust that people will then trust that the board will tell them the important things that they need to know. Does that make sense? spend a little time on linkage. We have about 3 minutes left, so I may not make it through all the slides today, but that's the blessing of having a third session, is I can bring the slides from next session into the next one. But linkage is the fancy governance word for stakeholders, for being in communication with your stakeholders. When I do this session in person, we talk about how the congregation members are stakeholders, but also your fellow other congregations around you. They are also stakeholders in your congregation. How well you are doing affects them. If you're struggling, it affects them. Other churches in your community could also be stakeholders because you're in shared ministry with them in different ways, especially in social justice often. Other non-religious organizations may be stakeholders in your church, especially if you're in partnership with them. Your renters may be stakeholders in your congregation. The board has a responsibility to be in communication with not just the members of the congregation, but with the broader community that your congregation serves. So I'm going to jump a few slides. Hang with me. We will get to all these in the next meeting. I apologize, I took a little too long today. And they're more technical things, so we'll come back to those. I wanted to close by naming 2 resources. I named this in the last session. I want to name it again. And that is the 12-part board leader training program that's at UUA LeaderLab. That is all online, that is free to you, because thank you for your congregation's donations to the annual program fund of the UUA that lets me have this really cool job and lets us create resources like this for you and your congregations. But it is a 12-part board training series that is available. It's got readings, it's got videos, it's got all kinds of things to be able to engage all the different topics of being a board member. And it's made into 12 sessions for the idea that a board could make the choice that over a year, they as a board are going to engage 1 module per month and give 15 to 20, maybe even 30 minutes of a board meeting as time to discuss what your group learning in that module together. But it also works for new board members to be able to go in and do your own engagement, to do your own development. Some of the topics that we engaged today, understanding of human nature, the myth of rationality, the good boundaries, healthy communications. So those are just some of the roles and responsibilities for governance. So know that this resource is also there for you beyond these Board Basics webinar series. And there will also be a few other resources that are attached to this for you to engage with. So thank you all. It's been wonderful being with you all today. Once again, I apologize. We went deep into the important stuff. We will go into all of it next month, and I promise I will make the timing work. You all have a wonderful evening, and I will see you again soon.